Both the Prime Minister and U.S. President before him resolute in their desire to make sure Vladimir Putin does not blame the West for what unfolded in his country over the weekend. Putin briefly addressed Russians late this afternoon, saying those who staged what he calls a mutiny miscalculated, but that those who did not, quote, shed blood could sign a contract with the Russian Defense Ministry or move to Belarus. Putin made those comments after the head of a notorious private army called Wagner mounted a rebellion against military leadership that made its way to Moscow but ended up abruptly stopping short. The leader of that group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, launched the rebellion following weeks of criticizing Russia's war on Ukraine and the Kremlin's justification for it. The rebellion, as I mentioned, ended just short of Moscow, with Prigozhin exiled to Belarus. His troops, it appears, will not face repercussions. Here to unpack what all of this means for Vladimir Putin and his war on Ukraine is former U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Secretary Panetta, good to see you again. Thank you for making the time.
Good to be with you.
Do you think Vladimir Putin is permanently weakened by what happened in his country over the last number of days?
Well, there's no question that when you have chaos and instability, particularly when you're an autocrat who prides himself on maintaining control, and suddenly you're the target of a coup against you, there's no question that that has weakened Putin. On the other hand, I don't think we ever should underestimate Putin. Since he's still in power, he still remains a force.
He himself, Secretary, called it a mutiny. Did it take you by surprise? Did the sort of advent of that mutiny onto Moscow, even though it was stopped short, as I mentioned, did it take you, were you expecting it in any way?
Well, you know, it was interesting to kind of follow the events with the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, who kept getting more and more critical of the defense ministry of Putin and how they were handling the war in Ukraine. And I kept wondering how Putin could kind of stand back and allow Prigozhin to continue to talk that way. And it obviously came to a head when it was clear that they were going to have the Wagner Group, Prigozhin's forces, required to become part of the Russian military. And that's what Prigozhin reacted against, and ultimately what produced this coup against Putin. So in some ways, the fact that it happened and they went 120 miles away from Moscow, it indicated that that there was a danger here that this coup could be successful, and some of that's surprising. But the fact that it happened and that Prigozhin decided to take this step, it's not totally surprising. In many ways, Putin is paying a price for having created the Wagner Group himself, and now it's turned on him.
What does it indicate to you that Putin allowed Prigozhin to be exiled to Belarus rather than face some kind of public punishment in Russia?
Well, it's an interesting question because here you have somebody like Putin who was facing a coup against his power and basically labeled Prigozhin a traitor and that this was indeed an insurrection. And in most countries, if you have an insurrection, you're going to take action against those that created the insurrection. They're going to be held responsible for taking that action. For Putin now to allow the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, I guess for that matter, the opportunity to basically either go home or stay in Belarus or return to fighting is not what what you would expect somebody like Putin to do. So he clearly understands that they represent a force. He saw people take to the streets in Russia, you know, cheering on Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. And I think for that reason, Putin is being very careful about how tough he is with them. And now, how that reacts, what happens as a result of that, no one really knows at this point.
Speaking of the idea of being very careful, I selected the clips that we heard from U.S. President Joe Biden and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau off the top of this segment very specifically, and for a reason. I thought it was interesting that they both went to great lengths to say, you know, we don't want to give Vladimir Putin any reason to blame the West for this. It's too early to speculate on the kind of full consequences or the fullness of the consequences that might arise because of what has transpired in Russia. This is an internal thing that happened. Why do you think our political leaders are going to such efforts to make sure that is clear?
I think the United States and our allies are saying exactly the right thing, which is that they had absolutely nothing to do with what occurred in Russia, and that their primary focus is to stay focused on supporting Ukraine. And I think that is the right step to take. The reality here is that I think that it's pretty obvious that what happened here was the result of Prigozhin and the Wagner group refusing to become part of the Russian military force. And because of his disagreements with the defense minister, this is something that is an internal battle within Russia itself. And for that reason, no one is quite sure what's going to happen next.
You've been a part of so many of the conversations that I imagine are taking place among our allies right now about how to navigate this going forward. What do you imagine that conversation is like at the moment, especially against the backdrop, of course, of Russia's war on Ukraine?
Well, I think the conversation would obviously be what is in the interests of the United States and our allies at this point in terms of making sure that they do not become part of the argument within Russia as to what happened there, but rather stay focused on providing security for themselves and providing support for Ukraine. I think that has to remain their primary focus. And it makes a great deal of sense that ultimately Putin is going to have to, since this is Putin's problem and it was created by Putin, it's going to have to be resolved by Putin.
Secretary, what do you think the implications are for Russia in Ukraine specifically? And by that, I mean, we are talking about sort of Putin's power within Russia being weakened vis-a-vis what happened over the weekend. Does this also weaken the Russian position in Ukraine?
Well, there's no question that I think Russian power has diminished as a result of the decision by Putin to go into Ukraine in the first place. Everyone thought it would just take a few days. And suddenly the Ukrainian fighters rose up with the support of the United States and our allies and stopped the Russian invasion. Russia's economy has been impacted by the sanctions. Putin's power has been impacted by the fact that that war has not gone well. So almost everything that Putin has done with regards to Ukraine has gone in the wrong direction. And so I ultimately think that because Ukraine is so focused and because their fighters are so good, that their effort to now put pressure on Russia to take advantage of this moment and really push hard on their offensive is exactly the right thing to do. And I guess our hope is that ultimately Ukraine will be successful in pushing Russia back out of these areas that they took over, and that ultimately either Putin decides to leave Ukraine or decides to engage in negotiations. Either way, the Ukraine will have developed the leverage it needs in order to bring this war to an end.
Yeah, I wonder, just before I let you go, Secretary, if you think what has happened to Vladimir Putin over the last few days might overall in the long term impact his calculation in deciding whether to do one of those two things that you just described, A, leave Ukraine, or B, start negotiating?
Well, I would like to believe that, but I also have to tell you that, you know, from my own intelligence background, I think everybody knows that Putin, a former KGB agent, is not somebody who is going to kind of resolve this issue through negotiations. He's going to basically double down as he has and keep fighting. So I think the only way to deal with Putin in the end is by force, and that's exactly what Ukraine is doing.
Secretary Panetta, I'll leave it there. I very much appreciate your analysis and insights this evening. Thank you.
Good to be with you.